Welcome to module 7. In this module, we will go through the allocation process or allocation methods that are used when you have systems where you have multiple products that are being made. Basics. When do we need allocation? There are three kinds of processes that you can come across in your system boundary when you build your LCA. One is multi-output process. In multi-output process, if a process produces two or more products, the question is that how much of the impact such as resource consumption or emissions that can be attributed to one of the products. So, it might be that your process is making multiple products and only one of that is actually part of the life cycle of the product that you are studying. So, in that case you definitely have to know how much you want to allocate. Then there is multiple input. If a process has multiple inputs, say a waste treatment process, this is really important when we have recycling of multiple products and each contribute to an output or impact such as toxic emission. So, then in that case we are considering how much of the impact can be attributed to one of the input processes. Because waste recycling, we need to understand whether one recycling product A versus product B has heavier contribution to the recycling process impact. And then there is open loop recycling. Open loop recycling happens when we have a product A which is recycled into a different product and eventually discarded as product B. An example could be we take a waste cardboard and we actually make a paper cup out of it. So, we have a product A which is the waste cardboard that is recycled and it is discarded as the paper cup. In this case, how much of the original resource consumption, impact of recycling process or impact of disposal can be attributed to product A versus product B. So, imagine that you are making cardboard. So, there is definitely resource consumption and emissions during cardboard manufacturing. The question is that can a part of that and how much of that will be allocated to eventually to the paper cup, because the cardboard ran its life cycle and then it is used in the second life. This is what we call as multiple life cycle allocation problem. So, we will come across at least the multiple output process in our process LCA and we will look at the allocation through that. We will also look at the multiple input. For open loop recycling, we will find an example and we will go through some of the questions on how do we study the recycling impact. Multiple output process need for allocation. So, this is an example, simple example of a multiple output process. You have a process which takes raw materials, energy and it makes two products, product A and product B, and also releases emissions. Both product A and product B are useful, but for your life cycle analysis that you are studying, only product A is what is part of your life cycle system boundary. Your product B is just a co-product. In this case, you do need to understand how do you allocate impacts, which is raw material, energy and emissions, to your choice of product. So, these are the rules. There are hierarchy of rules for multiple output process. What is stated is first that we need to avoid allocation if possible. Allocation generally brings in uncertainty in the LCA results. So, our ideal situation will be if we have enough information to actually avoid allocation. The second one is if we cannot avoid allocation, then we allocate inputs and emissions among the useful co-products using physical relationships such as mass. So, in this case, we can think of system expansion, where if we know that there is a process that can make the product B, then we allocate based on that physical relationship, and we will see an example of this as well. The third one is that if physical relationship is not available, which is mostly the case in multiple co-product process cases, then we can use the cost. This is of course the least accurate. So, as you go from points 1 to 2 to 3, the accuracy reduces, but ease of application of course increases. So, how can we avoid allocation? The first is the way to avoid allocation is that we divide the process into sub-process. So, for example, we had the big process which was taking in raw materials, energy, making product A and product B and giving emissions. In this case, if we can obtain enough information that we separate out the production of A and production of product A and product B within that process through these sub-processes, then we can allocate the impact of sub-process A to product A and sub-process B to product B. This is only possible when production pathways for A and B can be completely separated, that is A and B are not products of the same pathway or reactions. This is one example of this. Let us say we have a factory that is making a square metal piece and also making a circular, and there could be a very different pathway of making circular and square one, and there could be different lathe machines. In this case, both of those are operating independently, and hence even though they are part of the same manufacturing plant, we can separate out the pathways for those and allocate the impact, avoid allocation and actually get an accurate information for impact for product A and product B. However, generally the co-products are not separable into completely independent pathways, and that is because most of the industries are working more efficiently. They want to use same kind of machines for production of multiple products. It is more efficient and hence they do this, but it is hard for us to separate out the impact for product A and product B unless we take very accurate measurements of how much time is spent in time and energy is spent in production of each product separately. So, this makes avoiding allocation nearly impossible. Okay. Another way to avoid allocation is to use system expansion. So, in this case we have the same process. This process is taking input raw materials R and energy E, then we have emissions, product A and product B. Here in this case what we do is we assign all burdens to the primary product of interest, say product A, and then we give credits for materials or energy that are displaced by other co-products of the process. This is because what happens is that while making product A, we are also making product B. If we had a separate process, let us say there was another manufacturing process that was only making product B, then what the process is doing is it is displacing the amount of product B that is being made in some other process. So, in this case product A, because of its production, we are also making some amount of product B and we are displacing the requirement of raw materials RB and EB in the manufacturing process. So, precisely what we are saying is that making of this product B, this product is the co-product, and because of this co-product I am displacing the manufacturing of this product. So, if there was a 10 kg of this made, then this will require to make 10 kg less, which means that we will be saving some of the raw materials and energy and emissions in the process for only product B. So, this is what we call as system expansion by giving credit. So, here then our actual impact that we give to product A is E minus EB, R minus RB and EM minus EMB, because we are giving the credit to product A for displacing the required amount of product B manufacturing from some other process. So, this can be an example could be that if we are making energy and let us say a combined heat and CHP kind of plant is there, we are making heat and electricity together. So, we can give credit to the heat production plant for the co-generation of electricity and reduce the amount of emissions from other electrical production unit. We will see an example of this when we go through the allocation quantitative examples. Of course, this is not suitable when the co-product has no other commercial production process. So, this is only suitable when we know that there is another commercial production process that is making the product B, and that is why we are giving this displacement credit to the production of process product A. Then in the last step we avoid allocation not possible. In that case we use physical relation to to allocate burdens. And in this case, it's a very straightforward way, that if we know how much product A mass, which is MA, and product B mass, MB, is being made, then we use the unitary method. We just allocate the resource to product A as R times MA by MA plus MB, which is the total production of A. So, this is just saying what fraction of my resource and energy consumption was used towards the production of A versus production B based on the mass basis. Similarly, you will allocate the emissions to product A and product B. You can do it based on volume production. You can do it based on the energy embedded in the product A and product B, but also you can do it based on the cost if we do not have the mass available. So, this is the most simple way of when we cannot avoid allocation, then we do an allocation based on the mass basis. So, again these are the rules for allocation of multi-output process. First is that in LCA we try to avoid allocation as much as possible. If we have information about sub-processes or system expansion, we do that. If we cannot avoid allocation, then we allocate inputs and emissions among the useful co-products using physical relationships such as mass, volume or energy. And if physical relationship is not available, then we can use cost of each of the product. We will go through more detailed examples of system expansion and allocation rules in the next few minutes, and then we will go into the computational structure. So far we have seen how to allocate in case avoiding allocation is not possible. But in cases where avoiding allocation is possible by system expansion, we will now go through the details of how system expansion is taken care of. So, when we are thinking about system expansion, essentially what we are doing, we are trying to avoid allocation by crediting the product for displacement of processes somewhere else. By that, what we mean is that if there is a co-product that is being made as part of the production of our dedicated product, we are also avoiding environmental impact due to the production of that co-product. And in this further, what we will see is for examples of how to do this. When we think about system expansion, there are essentially 4 steps that we think. One is, first we start thinking about, is it a joint production or combined production? We will see what the definition of joint production or combined production is in a few seconds. Then we identify the determining product for joint production. Generally, the determining product, if it is the focus of our LCA, determines the whole scaling. If it is not the main focus of our LCA and it's a co-product, then we also account for that as part of the system boundary if it is included. Step 3 is identifying the intermediate processes and then identifying the displaced processes. Remember that for system expansion, our overall goal is to avoid allocation by giving some credit to the main product by identifying the displaced processes and also the intermediate processes. So, we will see how do we do this. First, let us go through the definition of joint production versus combined production. Joint production is something when our relative output volume of the co-products is fixed. If we have a process where 2 different products are being made, we cannot change the scale of the process without changing one of the products. So, the relative output volume is fixed. This is mainly the case when we have stoichiometry based relation between 2 products. Combined production is when we can independently vary the output of 2 different products. This could be something where we have parallel assembly lines or where we can have subsystems separated. An example would be when we are making plastic bags and we have 2 different types of plastic bag. Let us say we are making an oval shaped and a rectangular shaped. Oval shaped production does not really affect the rectangular shaped productions. It is independent. So, that in that case, that process is called combined production. So, when we have a combined production, we can simply avoid allocation by identifying how much is the change or consequence of change in the output of co-product of interest is without the change in output of other co-products. So, if my plastic bag type A or the oval type is the focus, then we can simply scale up or scale down for that production if that is the focus of our LCA. We do not need to bother about the other type. So, that is the case of combined production. Here we do not have to allocate any impact from the production of the oval bag to the other type of bag. However, when we have joint production, we can only avoid allocation by system expansion. And in system expansion, we have to identify what is the amount of product that is being displaced as the co-product is being made. As we see the examples, this will become more clear. But for now, I would like you to remember what is a joint production and what is combined production. Next is determining product versus non-determining product. These are essential definitions as you look at the processes that you are including in the system boundary for your LCA. Determining product is something that determines the production volume of the process. This may or may not be the focus of your LCA. For example, if you are making electricity in a combined heat generation plant, then electricity may be the driving factor for the operation of that process. Heat cogeneration is just a byproduct. So, that is the determining product, and if you are doing an LCA where electricity production is the main focus of your LCA, then that is the determining product for your LCA. There can be any number of co-products. Of course, we can have a process that has lot of co-products, but mostly in our manufacturing process there is only one determining product that determines the scale of the process. This is mainly the product that has the highest value in terms of selling to the market. So, you might have a process that is making 3 products, but your product A might have the highest selling value, and that will become the determining product for the manufacturer or the operator to scale your process. What determining product means is that this is the product that will be affected, that will change the process scale by the change in demand of this product. Since this product has the highest selling value in the market, your operator will be looking at scaling your process based on this particular product demand. So, let us look at an example of determining product versus co-product. This is a process for sunflower production, and from the sunflower oil production, you basically have the input of sunflower, you extract sunflower oil, and as a co-product we get the roughage, which is the pressed cake, which has mostly the protein. Since sunflower oil is the high value product, which is the 63% income for this producer, that will be the determining product for this process. And since pressed cake with protein only has 37% income for this producer, that will be your co-product. And the demand for co-product, which is the protein cake, is not determining product, and the reason is that because the demand for this protein can be fulfilled by other cheaper sources in the market such as soya meal. So, in this case your determining product is sunflower oil, and the non-determining product, co-product, is the pressed cake. However, this is again dependent on the market. If your market becomes unsaturated for the demand of protein, let us say there is an increased demand of this kind of roughage protein for feeding into animal industry or for putting as an input to cakes and other bakery items, in that case your market may require more of the sunflower cake or the pressed cake. Hence, the producer may decide to actually scale up the production to increase the pressed cake production and store the extra sunflower oil for future market sale. Hence, in this case your determining product then becomes your pressed cake. Now, when you include this process in your LCA system boundary, it will depend on what is the determining product which is the main key input to your LCA system boundary. So, as you see, if you are dealing with a process that has multiple co-products and products, it all depends on which product is actually the input to your LCA system boundary. The other co-product is merely existing as a byproduct, and you will need to decide how to allocate the impact of this process to the LCA. And of course, by system expansion we are not doing direct allocation. We will hence figure out how to give appropriate impact to the product that you are considering. To decide the determining product of a process, analyze if that process has an alternate mode of competitive production and how it is included in the system boundary for your LCA. The next definition that we come across in the system expansion is intermediate processes. So, intermediate processes are those processes that take place between the split off point where a dependent co-product leaves the processing route of the determining product and the point of displacement where the dependent co-product can displace another product if it can. So, let me explain it very simply. This is mainly the process that we need to include so that your co-product becomes an input to some other market. In the case that it is actually leaving the original process and it is entering some other process for identifying the displacement. An example would also be, let's say, a waste recycling process. If we have a waste as co-product and we have a waste recycling process, that waste recycling process is actually an intermediate process because it is taking the waste and it is processing it so that it becomes a product to be used further. And we will see an example, so the flow chart will give you more clarity. A split off point can always be determined from where the co-product can become a waste to be treated. So, where the co-product leaves the original process and it can become a waste to be treated, or it can also displace another process when displacement point will be determined. And by displacement we just mean that it becomes a substitute to the product from some other process. So, in summary, the intermediate process is decided by whether the dependent co-product is utilized fully in other process or whether the dependent co-products actually displaces other products. So, you will decide the intermediate process. In case it is actually utilized fully in other process, then it will have to be pre-processed. So, you will have, for example, a recycling process, and if it is just going to actually displace other product, then there might not be any intermediate process because it is directly displacing the other product. The volume of the intermediate process is fixed by the volume of the original process or the determining product. So, remember that your intermediate process is taking care of the co-product. Since in a joint production your co-product amount is dependent on the original product scale, therefore, your intermediate process scale is also determined by the original process scale, and your intermediate process impact is fully ascribed to the determining process for the original product. So, here remember what we are doing is we are trying to identify what intermediate process will be needed so that we can utilize the co-product in another process. However, the volume of the co-product is determined by the original process that is making the product of choice, and therefore, your intermediate process scale is fixed by the scale of the original process. So, let's understand all of this through a generic diagram. So, let us say we have a process A which is a co-producing process or it is a joint production. So, we are making product A which is the determining product for the co-producing process. So, this is the product that we are interested in to actually make for study in our LCA. In this case, your co-product is actually going to process 1 which is the intermediate treatment. And it is also, since we have an intermediate treatment, we are displacing or avoiding waste treatment of co-product. Let us assume that this waste or this co-product was going to be a waste. Instead of that waste, now we are treating it in an intermediate process to be used somewhere else. An example would be, let's say we are going to discard our cardboards. So, cardboards could be going to landfills. Instead of that landfilling process, we are taking those cardboards and doing a recycling as an intermediate treatment. So, your process W is the landfilling process and your process I or the intermediate treatment is the recycling process for that cardboard. The recycled cardboard, which is now an output of the intermediate treatment, forms product B, which is the recycled, and that is the co-product that is being utilized for another product. So, your process B is in which the co-product is utilized. The avoided product is our process D, which is displaced or avoided subsystem, and that is basically the most sensitive supplier. So, here what you are seeing is that you are seeing how do you expand your system boundary to be able to give credit to product A for all the process D that is displaced. So, here what we will do is we will give the process W, which is the displaced one, is going to be given to product A. Intermediate treatment is also going to be given to product A, because without that your product A will not be able to discard your product waste, which is the co-product. But we are also giving the credit of process D, which is the displaced process, because we are using the co-product from process A itself. So, you will have to determine which process is being displaced and which is the intermediate treatment. The displaced one will give credit to product A. For intermediate treatment, we will add that impact to product A. So, that is how we avoid allocation of the impact of co-product to the product A itself. So, we will go through some simple rules for system expansion and then we will see an example for system expansion in case of cogeneration of electricity, so that you understand how we are accounting for avoiding allocation in the case of joint production. This is a really complex process because there are a lot of cascading effect, but simple examples will help you understand the rules when you encounter such a process in your LCA system boundary. So, let us look at the simple rules. The first is, when a non-determining co-product is not displacing other products, all processes in the entire life cycle of the co-product shall be fully ascribed to product A. Let us try to understand this. What it means is that we have a joint production. As you saw, there was process A that was making a product A and co-product B. So, co-product B is your non-determining co-product because your process is actually driven by the demand of product A in the market. So, if your co-product B, which is not displacing any other product in the market, then all processes in the entire life cycle should be given to product A. And this is because the whole system that is included in your system boundary is actually catering to the need of making product A and not product B. So, your product B is generally just going to the waste, and that waste process impact should also be ascribed to product A. So, in this case you will not be able to give any credit to product A, but all the waste treatment and everything should be ascribed to product A. Next, if your non-determining product is fully utilized in other process and actually displaces other products there, product A shall be credited for the processes which are displaced by the co-product. But the intermediate treatment, which is the difference in the co-product and displaced product, should be ascribed to product A. So, let us try to understand this point again. Here what it means is that, let us say the co-product, which was the co-product B, is now fully utilized in some other process. For example, if we had a cardboard board that we were going to discard, and now we are actually recycling it and fully utilizing it in something else, let us say making a paper bag. In this case, the product A is actually going to give credit for displacing the paper production that was going to be used for paper bag manufacturing, because now the waste cardboard is serving as the raw material here. So, in this case, product A is going to get the credit for the displaced paper manufacturing that was going to be used for paper bag. but the intermediate process, which is the recycling process for recycling of cardboard into a thinner material to make the paper bag, is going to be ascribed to product A. The reason is that without that intermediate process, the co-product from product A could not be utilized anywhere else. So, the burden of that treatment should be given to the original process, but the original process should be given the credit for displacing the raw material somewhere else. So, that is how we determine in case the non-determining product is fully utilized. So, that is the second rule. So, when you are looking at a process with multiple products, you would be looking at which is the determining, which is the non-determining product, and then the fate of the non-determining product. The fate of the non-determining product, if it is just going to waste, everything in the life cycle is going to be ascribed to the determining product. So, product A. If it is not going to waste and fully used in the market after being reprocessed into some new material, then the intermediate treatment goes to product A, the original process, but the displacement credit is given to the original product as well. Then the third scenario happens to the fate of the non-determining product is that your co-products are not utilized fully. That is, some part of it is disregarded as waste, but it is at least partly displaces another product. In this case, the intermediate treatment should be ascribed to product B. So, you see there is a difference here, because now not all product is being utilized in product B, some part of being waste. What that means is that there is a demand for that waste that product B is using. So, product B is now responsible for the treatment. So, the ownership of the treatment process or the intermediate process now goes to product B, and product B is now credited for the avoided waste treatment of the co-product. Because it could not fully displace the original raw material, there is still some waste product, but it will buy that waste from the process A, and it should be given the credit for avoided waste treatment. The remaining of the waste treatment should still go to the process A. So, now these simples rule, if you remember, when you are including processes with multiple co-products, it will simplify how you can do the system expansion to be able to ascribe the right impact to the product that you are manufacturing, and that is in the system boundary that you are looking for your LCA. Let us look at an example of system expansion for cogeneration of heat and electricity. So, I have referenced this process while we were looking at the system definitions or the production and the joint production definition. So, this is what happens in the electricity generation. Most of the time, electricity generation is often accompanied with waste heat which can be used, thus many plants are called cogeneration plants. So, lot of these electricity plants will also have waste heat that can be recirculated. So, if you have to represent the cogeneration plants as a process in your system boundary, we have two outputs, electricity and heat. Main product of interest for our LCA is electricity production. So, we are including this cogeneration plant in our system boundary because we are interested in studying the impact of electricity production. And the goal of our study is mostly to look at the environmental impact of electricity production. So, this is a case of joint production because we cannot avoid the heat production while we are making electricity. So, we cannot separate the two production in this case, hence it is a case of joint production, which means that when it is a joint production, we also have to think which is the determining product and which is the non-determining product for this process, and we will be avoiding allocation using system expansion. So, let us say how do we handle the co-product in cogeneration plant. If we were not aware of the system expansion process, lot of time people will do a simple allocation which is not recommended by the ISO standards. So, ISO does not prefer allocation because it is not a proper or accurate allocation or the accurate description of the actual impact of that production. So, in the simple allocation case, lot of time people will just take the energy content that is in the heat and electricity and then allocate the impact in terms of energy content. You must be aware the quality of energy in electricity and heat is different. Heat is a lower quality energy and electricity is a very high quality energy. So, it makes sense to not actually just use the energy content for it to allocate. So, that is why ISO does not recommend, and most of the times this is not the right way of actually allocating, but it is a more simpler way in case you do not want to go through the complex process of system expansion. So, let us say if we want to avoid allocation in this case, we will consider the scenarios. The first scenarios is, if you remember, we had rule number 2. In rule number 2, if the co-product is not fully utilized. So, in this case, in scenario 1, we are saying that heat is being co-generated, but it is not fully utilized in the heat market. Sorry, it is fully utilized in the heat market. This means that the co-generated heat actually displaces some production from alternative heat generation. So, what that means is that when the heat is fully utilized in the market, it means that the demand for heat from other process that was producing heat, let us say a natural gas based boiler that was being used, is now reduced demand. So, we will be able to give credit to the electricity production in the amount of impact associated with the equal amount of heat being produced by the other process. So, here when the co-product is fully utilized, we are giving credit to the original product. In this case, our co-generated heat is fully utilized in the market. So, we are giving credit to the electricity for displacement of environmental impact somewhere else. But there should be added extra environmental impact. And think about where does the added extra environmental impact comes from. It comes from the intermediate process, because you also need to distribute the heat. So, let us see how that looks like. We have a cogeneration plant, we are making electricity and heat. It is a joint production because we cannot separate the electricity and heat production. Our determining product in this process is electricity, product A. It takes raw materials R, energy E, and it makes emissions EM. Our goal is to assign some of these raw materials, energy and emissions to electricity A, but we know that heat B prime is also going to take some of those values. So, how do we ascribe properly? In the scenario 1, we saw when heat is completely being utilized in the market, which means that it is displacing some of the amount of production from this plant which is boiler based. So, we have an alternative process for making heat in the market, and that demand is going to reduce because we are going to meet certain amount of demand by B prime. So, in this case, we will give credit of amount of B prime to electricity by reducing the impact. So, we will be estimating how much of the impact in raw materials and energy and emission from the heat generation plant of boiler based is happening for B prime amount of heat, and that amount will be credited to electricity A. So, actual impact for electricity A will be R minus RB, E minus EB, and emissions will be EM minus EMB. So, now your boiler based heat generation plant only needs to make B minus B prime amount of heat for the market, and that means that now we have a reduced environmental impact, which is credited to the electricity, because electricity generation has led to reduction in the amount of that resource and emission requirement for meeting the heat demand. However, there is a intermediate process as we discussed. So, the intermediate process will be heat distribution process. We are not going to just leave heat out. So, the co-generated heat may be carried as part of a water that is being heated and recirculated, or there could be other pipeline that would be used. So, the heat distribution process, which is the process 3, also has its own associated impact, and that impact is going to be also allocated to electricity generation, because without this process, which is the intermediate process, the heat cannot be sent to the market and electricity cannot get the credit for the displaced product of boiler based heat generation. So, in system expansion, if you have a process that is being credited for displacing the production of co-product in some other place, the impact of handling the co-product, which in this case is the heat, should be attributed to the original product being produced, which in this case is electricity. I hope this example gives you a very clear view of how to handle co-products when they are in part of your system boundary and when they are part of a joint production. Let us consider second scenario. In the second scenario, let us say your market for co-generated heat is saturated. So, when it is saturated, it means that no matter how much waste heat is being co-generated in the electricity plant, it is not going to be used anywhere. In this case, your any change in electricity production demand just creates additional heat without any displacement of heat generation plant. In this case, your electricity will not be credited for any heat co-generated since there is no displacement. All impacts of that process 100% are attributed to electricity generation, and the impacts for distribution of waste heat is given to heat, because you are not being used, it is not being used anywhere. So, you note that we only gave credit for displacement at one level, that is co-generation got credit for displacing impact from heat generation unit. However, this is a complex thing, so such displacement can be cascading. So, for example, your displacement of water requirement for additional heat generation also leads to displacement of energy for pumping. So, you see there is a second order effect that is happening. When you are requiring less water for in your heat generation, because now you have a co-generated heat that is displacing the requirement of heat, you are also requiring less energy for pumping, and now where that energy is coming from? It is coming from electricity plant. So, now you are seeing that as you go deeper into understanding the second order and third order effect, which is also called its supply chain effect, but in this case we are going to call it the network effect, we will be looking at displacing at several steps. You have further demand in electricity, so your electricity demand will be reduced. So, electricity production starts getting credit for its own impact, since its co-product is reducing the demand for additional production, and this is where what we call is the beginning of network effect rather than a linear chain effect. And in LCA, what we do is we start looking at the network algebra, or we will get to that computational structure soon, where we will be able to capture all these in a very simple linear algebra format, or what we call as the matrix algebra for LCA calculation. As you can see and imagine that if you had to manually do this again and again by understanding where you are giving credit and where you are not, you would be not able to track all the effects. Hence, we go to the computational structure for LCA to capture this network effect. So, in summary, for system expansion, our first step, whenever you look at a product or a process that has co-product, think about whether it is a joint production or combined production. If it is a combined production, it is a simple decision. You can scale the product of your choice independently of the co-product. So, you do not have to worry about the co-product. You can use the system partitioning by knowing of the parallel production process. But if it is a joint production, then it becomes a challenge, and you need to think wisely onto how to ascribe the environmental impact of that process to the product that you are studying. So, the second step would be identifying the determining product for joint production. So, mostly this is the product that would be focus of your LCA. If it is not the product of the focus of your LCA, then you need to focus how to identify what impact is ascribed to the co-product if that product is part of your LCA. Then you need to identify the intermediate process which determines how the co-product is being handled, and the intermediate process impact is generally given to the determining product in case of the scenario when you have the market not matured. And then you have to identify the displaced process. Most of the time there might be an alternative production route for the co-product, and that is the one that is displaced. In case there is no alternative production route, then you do not have any displaced processes. So, anytime you come across such a case, remember these 4 steps, and this will really help you to identify how do you ascribe the actual impact to the product of your focus of LCA study. So, we will quickly do a thinking activity. I already showed you how to do the system expansion for the cogeneration of electricity and heat. What we will do quickly is to go through these steps, thinking about the steps of system expansion, so that it becomes clear in your mind how do you want to go about the system expansion. So, I will mention the 4 steps. First 30 seconds, think about step 1 and step 2, draw the expanded system boundary based on this, and then we'll come back, we will go through that, and then we will go 30 seconds again for step 3 and step 4. Alright, so let's look at step 1 for our system expansion. First we have to think, is it a joint production or combined production? We already talked about that this is a joint production process because we cannot separate out electricity production with the heat production. Step 2, identifying the determining product for joint production. If the goal of your LCA is to study the impact of electricity generation, then electricity is your determining product for this joint production. So, let us say electricity is our determining product. Take next 30 seconds to think about step 3 and step 4 for the system expansion. Our step 3 is identifying the intermediate process. We are going to actually consider the scenario when your market is not saturated and this co-generated heat is actually going to be used in the market for heat demand. So, in this case our intermediate process will be heat distribution process, because that process determines how do we send the heat to the market. So, our heat distribution process is our intermediate process in the system expansion. The step 4 is to identify the displaced process. Since we know that we have a boiler based heat generation plant, hence this cogeneration plant is actually displacing some of the production requirement from this boiler based heat generation plant. So, that is our displaced process. In this case, we will be giving some credit equivalent to the B prime amount of heat production from the boiler based plant by scaling down, and that credit will be going to the electricity. But we will be allocating the impact associated with heat distribution process to our electricity production as well. So, this way you can think of that whenever you are presented a case with a multiple co-product, you will be thinking of these 4 steps. Once you have identified these 4 steps, you will be able to know how much impact associated with that whole process is actually going to be assigned to your product, the focus of the product or the product that is included in your LCA, and you will prepare the life cycle inventory accordingly. Okay. So, in short, when we next see how we include all the data of the processes included into the network algebra, it will become more clear. So, what you will be doing is you will be preparing an updated inventory for the cogeneration plant and the associated impact for electricity A by including all these expanded system boundaries, so that you know what actual impact of the raw materials R, energy E and emission E is going to be part of your inventory for electricity A. Okay. With this, we come to an end to the scope phase of LCA. I will quickly review all the steps that we have discussed for scoping of an LCA. First, we started with identifying which options to model, which relates to the technology or the region that we are studying. Then we talked about the functional unit selection. We went through some exercises thinking about what is the functional unit that is used for scaling up or scaling down of your process. Then we talked about choice of impact categories and method of impact. This is also associated with the goal of your LCA. So, we decided which data to collect or what impact categories to include based on the goal. That really narrows down the scope of your LCA. We will also go in much more detail about the impact categories and impact assessment in the life cycle impact assessment stage. Then we went to the system boundaries. This is where you really start thinking about what processes do you want to include in your LCA. We talked about the accounting versus change oriented. That tells whether you have to focus on only the foreground processes, background process, or you want to include all the processes such as an attributional LCA. Then we talked about the process, EIO and hybrid LCA. So, process is when we are focusing mostly on most important processes, economic input output when we look at the whole economy, and hybrid LCA is a combination of both. In the next few lectures, we will look at the computational structures for process LCA and also economic input output LCA. Next, we talked about cutoff criteria that helps us determine to exclude some of the processes from your LCA. Since we talked that the LCA system boundary can keep on expanding, but we need to decide where to stop. For that decision, we came up with the quantitative cutoff criteria. The quantitative cutoff criteria are mostly based on mass based or any other decision criteria that the LCA analyst chooses. Last, we talked about allocation. Allocation defines how much of the actual impact of the processes that you are including in your system boundary should be ascribed to the product that is part of your LCA. So, we talked about partition. When it is not a joint production, when it is combined production, it is very easy to separate by partitioning or subsystem processing. We can also use simple allocation rules of mass based allocation, energy based or cost based allocation. But ISO prefers not to allocate. So, in case of joint production, you can do a system expansion approach to actually ascribe some of the impact to the product of your focus, and you can ignore rest of it by using the system expansion approach. All of this helps you determine what is the process that you are including or excluding in your LCA. This preparatory step is very crucial to do a full blown very good LCA. While LCA may seem like an accounting method, the decision that you make while you are doing a scope or scoping phase of your LCA really determines the value of the LCA in decision making. Hence, if you have a chance, do review all the scoping phase lectures. That will help you understand this topic really well and do a scoping for your own LCA. We will do a small course project that will help you understand the whole scoping process in much more detail. Next, we will move to the second step of LCA, which is the life cycle inventory. This is where we start talking about the data quality and the data collection, which is the heart and soul of doing a good LCA. That we will follow up in the next module. Next, we are going to go through the step 2 of LCA, which is the life cycle inventory. So, we started the LCA method by looking at the 4 different steps. We went through detail on the goal and scope. Now, we are going to look at the life cycle inventory step, which is mainly focused on data that is collected for defined goal and scope. And of course, in goal and scope, you know what kind of impact categories you are going to focus on and what the system boundary entails. What is life cycle inventory? The second stage of LCA is mostly collection of data, which is termed as life cycle inventory. What kind of data you are collecting is decided by the scope of your study that was chosen in stage 1 of LCA. Hence, scoping of your LCA is the most critical step for doing a good LCA, because that determines how much effort you need to put in collection of data and what kind of data, which is actually a time consuming and also a costly affair. The results, however, the results and quality of your LCA will directly depend on the quality of your data. If you don't collect good quality data from relevant sources, your LCA is not good. Like any modeling activity, garbage in is equal to garbage out. So, if you don't put good quality data, the results you make or get out of your LCA are going to be erroneous and not lead to the right decision making. Hence, we pay a huge amount of attention on collecting good data, even though this is a really tedious step. And of course, this will be the most tedious and time consuming step, and also one of the most limiting step, because lot of the times LCAs suffer from missing data or data which are not clearly written in terms of where it came from or what the data time stamping is. So, the data transparency is a huge issue in ensuring a good quality LCA. It is advised to collect and document all data that you find. Don't throw away data till the end. So, even though some of the data that you find are not going to be relevant for the goal of your LCA, we recommend to store the data unless you are done with your LCA and you have made the final decision. Still, it is a good practice to store data with the right stamping or the right metadata, so that you know what that data stands for. The major categories in LCI are this. So, if you have any process that you are including in the life cycle stages in your system boundary, there are two things that we look. First is the input and the second is the output. In the inputs, we have energy, raw materials, any supporting materials. The supporting materials include things like catalyst, it can include things like plastic packaging or other stuff, but it is anything that supports the production. In terms of outputs, we have products and co-products, which are the key output of your system or of your process. And then you have emissions such as air emissions, water emissions and solid waste, and there can be other releases, and other releases could be scrap that is not actually a waste that can be recycled, but it is released from the process. Then it depends on how that other releases are being treated, whether you want to allocate impact to it or you want to take care of the treatment of that or handling of those other releases. So, when we start collecting our life cycle inventory, when we look at the processes, these are the major categories that we focus on, and if any of the category is missing information, we really need to drive our focus into that category to see how do we improve the data collection in that category. In most of the processes, inputs are mostly given, outputs are also. It is the emissions where you will find missing information. Sometimes the co-products, if they are not valuable, also are missing in the LCIs, but co-products, if they are huge in volume, can be a very important aspect for system expansion. So, we do need to cover that information as well. What are the sources of data? So, most of the time as an LCA analyst, we can use data that is available from literature or software. It is most appropriate when we are comparing standard products and there are no changes in technology, geography or time scale. All your products can be exactly modeled by available modules in the software or literature, which means that this is mainly an LCA of already existing products for which there is plenty of information available. It could be a plastic manufacturing, it could be a glass manufacturing, it could be a steel manufacturing. These processes have been well known for decades and there are very well processed information for these processes in the literature or even in the software. But it is still tough to cross check consistencies and validity because of the historical nature of this data. Sometimes the metadata is not stored very well. So there might be an issue of whether this particular data belongs to the system LCA process stage that you are including in your system boundary. For example, a steel manufacturing unit may have reported data from 2000s, but in 2020 that data may have changed. So if you are doing an LCA of a steel manufacturing for the present era, your old data may still not be valuable or may not be valid. However, it can be used as a starting point or an approximation. So, a lot of time when you are doing LCA for already existing processes or well established products in the market, we look into the software or literature. But lot of times we need to build our own LCI, and it is most appropriate when we have a custom system boundary where the process being studied is new or unique. For example, if you are going to study an LCA of biologics or a biological vaccine manufacturer, the data may not be well documented, or the data in the format that you need for your LCA may not be existing. In this case, you as a LCA analyst may collaborate with an experimental scientist or a system modeler to actually generate that data or simulate that data. In this case, it is easier to cross-check errors, inconsistencies, since you have control over how data is collected or modeled. So, this is mostly a speculative LCA because that process may not be existing, or even if it is existing, it might not be at the scale that you are studying the whole LCA for your decision making. So, there are two ways. One, go for an existing literature and software that is available. Two, build your own LCI. In most of the cases, we tend to combine the two because we might have some processes which are old, which are very historical, and we have the data available, and in some of the processes in our system boundary may be new or emerging, and we can build that LCI based on our engineering or scientific knowledge. Some of the sources of data which is available is one of the easiest, but it is costly, is the proprietary software. So, there are a lot of softwares on the market such as Gabi, EcoInvent, SEMA Pro from the Franklin Associates that you can use. And lot of the LCA in the corporate world or in the engineering industries actually use these softwares to develop their LCA model. There are also free databases. So, the world is quickly trying to move towards shared databases or open sources. In this case, you can use data from OpenLCA, which is also a software that we will be looking in this course, how to develop a LCA in OpenLCA. So, that has data from US EPA and the National Risk Management Research Laboratory, and also global data that is in global average. You can also use National Renewable Energy Laboratory LCI, that is mostly only for US processes. If you want to develop LCI for Indian processes, you might have to go into the proprietary software. There is also GREET, which is the Greenhouse Gas Regulated Emissions and Energy Use in Transportation model. This is a free to use model mostly for transportation industry. This is developed by the US Argonne National Laboratory, and this is very focused on changing the transportation module. So, in this you will find data on different vehicles and vehicles emissions. So, it could be a diesel based transport, let us say a diesel based truck transportation or a railway cargo transportation. Of course, these all are average data. So, you will have to see how close the technology is for the region you are modeling. Then if you are interested in the building architecture or mostly on the construction side, then there is BEES, which is Building for Environmental and Economic Sustainability, and this is developed by NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US Maryland area. So, this is focused mostly on building products. So, if your LCA involves concrete and other building products, you might want to use this data. However, for this course, we will be looking at OpenLCA. We will be exploring some of the databases that are available in OpenLCA and construct a standard simple LCA case study to use to see how all the things come together for analysis. Other sources of data are literature sources. So, if you are in an educational institute that has access to published literature, then International Journal of LCA, Journal of Industrial Ecology and Journal of Cleaner Production regularly publishes LCA studies that demonstrate their data as well. Journal of Industrial Ecology is moving towards data badges to ensure data reliability. So you also find really good quality data because this has been vetted by researchers and it has been peer reviewed for use by other researchers. So of course, data becomes a very important aspect in doing a good LCA, and being vigilant about what data and from where you are using is an important aspect for your second stage of the life cycle inventory. Building our own LCI, this is an important aspect, and as engineers and scientists, we are very well equipped to do that. Lot of the time as engineers, we might be able to get this from process data from measurements in plants, meter readings or experiments, or also industry data reports. If you are working with an industry, it might be easy to get that data, but if you are not working for industry, it will be challenging. Some of the previous life cycle inventories, as I mentioned, you have to be cautious about the temporal issue, whether that data is still relevant for the manufacturing today. The last is process modeling. Lot of students as chemical engineers, we are very well equipped with process modeling, where we can use engineering knowledge to build models using reaction chemistry, process information to get material and energy balance, and validate data using thermodynamic laws. So you can use your engineering expertise to build a really good life cycle inventory for each of the process stages that are included in your system boundary. It is of course dependent on what processes you are using and whether the chemistry information for that process is well known. If you are expert in process modeling, I highly recommend for students to use process modeling to develop their own LCI, because it gives more accurate information and more control on the quality of your data. This is a typical data collection sheet that you might see in some industry. So here you can see different boxes where you have the company name, contact name, facility location. So if you are actually going out and collecting data on the facilities for the life cycle stages included in your LCA, you might be able to record all that information. You also include the temporal boundary, so the time stamp of the data collection. System specificity, remember in the scope phase we said that we identify which model to option, which option to model. So this is basically the technology represented. Then we have the material inputs and outputs. So you can see that material inputs to process include all the raw materials. It can also be the energy, and you can add more lines as needed for the specific process. The outputs are mainly the primary product, co-products, or there is also recycled scrap. So you can see that there are other releases and mainly products and co-products. There is also one section highlighted in red, you can see, where you have the transportation information. So this is the transportation life cycle stage in your LCA. Here you will be interested in recording the distance and mode of transportation, and this is the information that goes in the grid software to actually calculate the impact of transportation. And this information is generally recorded separately, but here you will have to work with the logistics managers or the logistics in the facility, whosoever is recording the logistics information. So this is a standard sheet. This you can use as a template to collect information on each of the processes that are included in your system boundary, and then you will collect all of that together to build the overall life cycle inventory. For data quality check, if possible, we collect error information such as measurement errors. We use mass balances such as water in equal to water out plus water consumed. Similarly, for the materials mass balances and energy balances. Wherever we see inconsistency, we know that there is something wrong with the data, and that helps us go back and improve that data. Summary, what we do is, for the life cycle inventory step, we draw a flow chart according to the system boundaries. Then we do the data collection for all the processes in the system. We can use that standard sheet that we just saw as a template. Then we calculate the environmental loads, resource use and pollutant in relation to the functional unit. The data you collect for the facility may not reflect the actual functional unit, so we will need to scale up or scale down. The whole process of collecting all the data and then putting it together into a calculation for the functional unit selected is accounted with the computational structure of LCA, which we will be looking at next. So, next what we will do is we will learn about the computational structure and put things together to actually do the calculation for the selected functional unit.